The church basement smelled of preserved vegetables and desperation. Snow fell thick outside the narrow windows, but inside, steam rose from opened mason jars as a woman in her 60s ladled stew into tin cups pressed forward by hollow-eyed children. Martha Henley moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to feeding multitudes, her calloused hands steady as she worked her way down the line of families crowded into the only warm space left in Milford Valley. Behind her, arranged on makeshift shelves constructed from salvaged lumber, stood 743 jars, each one labeled in careful script, each one representing a calculation the town had once dismissed as madness. The jars caught the lamplight like amber, their contents a spectrum of preservation, tomatoes dark as garnets, green beans sharp and bright, beets the color of old blood. These jars would feed 340 people for 73 days. 18 months earlier, the town had laughed at the widow who made them. The memory arrived unbidden as Martha's hand found the next jar. Spring morning, 1890, 6 months after Thomas died and left her the failing farm on the valley's western edge. She had knelt in the garden at dawn, her fingers working soil still cool from the night, when her grandmother's voice returned to her with the clarity of wind through limestone. The old woman's root cellar in childhood Tennessee, walls sweating moisture, thousands of jars arranged like an army against winter. When you can't control the weather, you control what you keep. The words had seemed quaint then, folk wisdom from a harder era. But Martha saw her garden differently that morning, not food for the present season, but survival stored against futures no one else imagined. She began calculating in the language of ratios and shelf life, translating dirt and seed into glass and time. The general store owner noticed when she started buying mason jars by the crate. Edwin Marsh watched her load the fourth box into her wagon, his smile bemused but not unkind. "Planning to open a restaurant, Martha?" She returned the smile but offered no explanation, knowing that truth without context sounds like prophecy, and prophecy invites mockery. She drove home past the construction site where Milford's future was taking shape in timber and ambition, the skeleton of the cooperative grain elevator rising against the sky like a cathedral to progress. The town had mortgaged its future for that structure, $12,000, every family's savings, their collective faith in abundance made architectural. Martha understood the impulse. She simply prepared for its opposite. The town meeting hall buzzed with excitement the evening Carlton Voss presented his final designs. The architect stood at the podium in a wool suit that cost more than most men's quarterly wages, gold watch chain catching lamplight as he gestured toward the drawings pinned behind him. 43 years old, Harvard-educated, Voss carried his credentials like a title. His elevator would hold 50,000 bushels of wheat through winter, eliminating their dependence on distant markets and eastern speculators. Self-sufficiency through engineering. Prosperity through planning. Martha sat in the back row, listening as he described the storage system, sealed wooden bins stacked 6 stories high, capacity calculated to the bushel. She raised her hand. The room quieted. "Mr. Voss, what happens if the wheat crop fails before we fill the elevator?" The laughter started in the front rows and rippled backward like wind through standing grain. Voss's smile held the patience of a man accustomed to explaining complex systems to simple people. "Mrs. Henley, we're building for abundance, not your widow's fear." She persisted, her voice steady but quiet. "My grandmother survived 3 famines. Storage means nothing without something to store." His face hardened, the smile becoming sharp. "Perhaps your energy would be better spent on domestic preparations." He gestured toward her work-worn hands, her plain cotton dress, and the room erupted. Someone in the middle shouted at first, "Martha's jar madness." And the phrase stuck like a burr, spreading through town with the velocity of shared ridicule. Within days, children chanted it when she passed. The general store displayed a cartoon in the window, a widow buried beneath toppling jars, her face twisted in theatrical panic. The local newspaper ran a full satire piece titled, "Widow Plans to Pickle the Entire County," complete with fabricated quotes and mock calculations. At the elevator's grand opening in October, Voss himself invoked the phrase during his dedication speech. "At least we're not succumbing to jar madness." The crowd roared approval, their laughter echoing off the fresh-painted pine. Martha stopped attending church that week. She stopped coming to town except for necessary supplies, her face burning with shame that settled into her chest like swallowed stones. But her hands never stopped moving. While the town celebrated its gleaming future, she retreated to her 40 acres and began building something else entirely. The land everyone pitied her for inheriting revealed its value slowly. The western edge of Milford Valley, where soil drained poorly and crops struggled, sat 40 feet higher than town center, elevation no one considered relevant until they needed it. Martha discovered what others had missed, a spring-fed creek that flowed year-round, cold and clean, cutting through the northwest corner of her property. Her grandmother's voice returned, "Water that flows is water that saves." She established her system with the methodical precision of someone building an ark. Garden plots rotated by season, harvest schedules calculated to maximize preservation windows, canning stations arranged for workflow efficiency. Her mornings began at 4:47, before first light, and lasted until sunset reduced the kitchen to shadows and lamplight. She processed tomatoes by the bushel, scalded for exactly 2 minutes, peeled by hand, packed in 3% salt solution. Green beans required blanching for precisely 3 minutes before packing with dill and garlic. Beets roasted at 375 degrees for 45 minutes, skinned while hot, pickled in vinegar solution measured to the quarter cup. Every jar received 15 minutes in boiling water for sterilization. Wax seals poured at 180 degrees, no hotter, no cooler. She maintained a ledger with the discipline of a quartermaster, jar number, contents, date sealed, projected shelf life. By August, 200 jars lined her cellar. By September, 400. The cellar itself was a gift from geology, natural stone walls that held steady at 56 degrees regardless of surface weather, perfect for long-term preservation. She tested seals weekly with ruthless standards, discarding any that showed the slightest compromise. Not a single jar spoiled. In late September, she began canning meat. Venison from a neighbor's hunt, rabbit she trapped herself, chicken she raised and slaughtered. Pressurized brine, careful timing, absolute sterility. The work consumed her completely, body and focus, until preservation became a kind of meditation. One evening, alone in her kitchen, she spoke the only philosophy she allowed herself: they build towers to touch heaven. I dig deep to survive hell. Her 800th jar sealed with a satisfying pop on the same October afternoon the church bells rang in town, celebrating the completion of Carlton Voss's cooperative grain elevator. The festival transformed Milford into something like a fair. The elevator dominated the skyline, 60 feet of white-painted pine, visible from 3 miles in any direction, a monument to collective ambition that cost exactly $12,000 in final accounting. The entire autumn harvest flowed into its bins, 50,000 bushels of golden wheat, the town's wealth made tangible and stored against winter. Voss stood on a hastily constructed platform, his voice carrying across the crowd. We've built our independence. No more reliance on distant markets or the charity of strangers. The applause rolled like thunder. Inside the elevator, wheat filled the sealed wooden bins to capacity, each kernel perfect, each bushel a promise of security. But Martha, standing at the crowd's edge, noticed what celebration obscured: no ventilation system, no airflow between the sealed bins, moisture trapped in wooden containers with nowhere to go. She mentioned it to a farmer standing nearby, keeping her voice neutral. Trapped moisture breeds mold in grain storage. He laughed without malice, already turning away. There goes jar madness, Martha again. A banner stretched across Main Street read, "No jar madness here," in letters 2 feet tall. The town's children performed a theatrical skit mocking the crazy widow and her pickle obsession, their exaggerated pantomime drawing roars of laughter. Martha watched from the periphery, then walked home in silence, her face burning again but her certainty unshaken. November brought signs that old farmers recognized and younger ones dismissed, geese flying south 2 full weeks ahead of schedule, in formations so large they darkened the noon sky. At the general store, men in their 70s mentioned this with unease, but Voss dismissed it as superstition. Progress has no place for old wives' tales. December arrived warm, then dropped into sudden cold, then warm again, temperature swings that confused the ground and the creatures living in it. Martha saw grasshoppers active in late December, birds fleeing the valley in waves. January 1891 brought snow, but wrong, wet and heavy, relentless, the kind that breaks tree limbs and buries fences. Voss celebrated at a town meeting, perfect moisture for spring planting. Martha added 50 more jars to her cellar that week, working through the night by lamplight. February 3rd, farmers opened the elevator for routine inspection and found disaster breeding in darkness, black mold spreading through 30% of the stored wheat, the grain rotting from trapped moisture and temperature fluctuation. Voss ordered the contaminated wheat removed and buried quickly, held an emergency town council meeting, and kept the crisis quiet. March arrived without mercy. The snow never stopped. March 15th, rain began, freezing, then more snow, then rain again. Rivers rose. Roads became impassable. On March 17th, the sky turned gray-green at dawn, and old farmers whispered one word, deluge. March 18th, 1891, 6:23 in the morning, the Milford Valley flood announced itself with a sound like continuous thunder rolling down from the north. Spring melt combined with 3 days of freezing rain overwhelmed the upstream dam, a structure built in 1867 and never properly maintained, its timber supports rotted through. The dam cracked, groaned, and collapsed within 90 seconds, releasing a wall of water 15 feet high that crashed through the valley with the force of divine judgment. The town received no warning. Telegraph lines were already down from ice storms, roads impassable, the world reduced to the narrow radius of what eyes could see through snow and rain. The cooperative grain elevator stood directly in the flood's path, white pine bright against the dark water, and Carlton Voss made the calculation that would define his legacy. He evacuated to the elevator, believing height offered safety. 47 townspeople followed him, climbing ladders to the upper storage level 60 feet above the valley floor. But the foundation was wood, posts driven only 8 feet deep into soil that was already saturated, already unstable. Water undermined the posts in less than 20 minutes. The structure didn't collapse immediately. It tilted, slowly, grain bins bursting as the building rotated, 50,000 bushels of wheat, 30% already rotted, spilling into flood water and creating a toxic sludge that turned the current black. People screamed, trying to reach the exits, but the shifting grain blocked doorways and buried ladders. The elevator became a tilting cage, rotating at an angle that made climbing impossible. 23 people drowned inside Carlton Voss's $12,000 monument to progress. The remaining 24 escaped through roof hatches, swimming through churning water to nearby buildings that still stood. Town center vanished beneath brown water that reached second-story windows. The general store disintegrated, its inventory floating past like funeral offerings. The church basement flooded, destroying hymnals and pews. Homes built without stone foundations simply lifted and swept away, their walls collapsing as they tumbled downstream. The flood lasted 41 hours before the water began its slow recession. When it finally drained, Milford Valley was unrecognizable, every food store destroyed, every root cellar flooded, livestock drowned in pastures, fields buried under 3 feet of silt and debris and death. The grain elevator stood at a 30-degree angle, grain rotting in its broken bins, a monument to hubris visible for miles. 89 people died. 340 survived with nothing, no food, no shelter, roads destroyed, the outside world unreachable. 5 miles west, on land 40 feet higher than the valley floor, Martha Henley's farm stood untouched. During the 41 hours of flooding, she maintained her normal routine with the calm of someone whose preparations were never meant for display. Morning, she descended to the cellar and checked the jars, 800 intact, temperature stable at 56 degrees, seals firm. Afternoon, she baked bread using flour stored in sealed tins, tended chickens in a coop built on elevated stone. Evening, She sat by the fire and read her grandmother's journal, adding one entry in careful script. They built high. I prepared deep. God judges the difference. She had no electricity to lose because she'd never relied on it. No supplies destroyed because everything that mattered was preserved in glass. No livestock drowned because her barn stood on a foundation of stone, elevated above the spring-fed creek that continued flowing clear and cold. March 20th, the flood receded enough for Martha to venture to the valley's edge. She stood in morning mist and looked down at what remained, the tilted elevator like a broken finger pointing at nothing, the muddy wasteland where the town had been, smoke rising from desperate fires built in the ruins. She knew what had happened without needing confirmation. She returned to her farm and waited, knowing that survivors would either remember or they wouldn't, and that her preparations were not contingent on gratitude. In the damaged church, 340 survivors huddled in the upper floor, the only dry space remaining in town center. The food inventory on the third day after the flood consisted of 12 loaves of bread soaked through with muddy water and 6 tins of sardines salvaged from the general store wreckage. Children cried from hunger with the thin, persistent sound of animals in pain. Adults sat in shock, staring at nothing, their minds unable to process the speed with which certainty had become ruin. Carlton Voss occupied a corner by himself, his gold watch stopped permanently at 6:23, his expensive suit caked in dried mud that he hadn't tried to clean. He stared at the wall and said nothing to anyone. On the third day, a woman named Sarah broke the silence. What about Martha Henley? Her farm is on the western ridge. The room went quiet. A young man spoke carefully, testing the idea. Jar madness, Martha. Her place is probably destroyed too. But Sarah persisted with the insistence of someone who had nothing left to lose. Someone should check. She might need help. An elderly farmer who had lost everything, home, livestock, 3 grandchildren, spoke the truth no one else would voice. Or she might have something we don't. Voss finally looked up, his voice hollow and strange. Send someone. I'll go. He and Sarah left at dawn on March 23rd, walking because every horse in town had drowned. The 5-mile journey took 6 hours through mud that sucked at their boots with every step, through debris fields where homes had been, past bodies they couldn't stop to bury. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the landscape wasn't already articulating with brutal clarity. When they crested the final hill and saw Martha's farm standing whole and untouched, smoke rising from the chimney like a promise, Voss fell to his hands and knees. Sarah caught his arm but he couldn't rise. His legs had simply stopped working. Martha was in the yard checking fence posts when she heard their approach. She turned, saw them collapsing at her gate, Voss on the ground, Sarah barely standing, and ran forward without hesitation. She caught Sarah before the woman fell, bearing her weight with strength earned from months of physical labor. Come inside. Now. She half-carried Sarah to the house, Voss stumbling behind on legs that shook like a newborn colt's. Inside, the house smelled of vegetable soup and fresh bread. The wood stove radiated heat. The floors were clean. Martha sat them at her kitchen table and brought hot coffee immediately, the cups burning their hands in a way that felt like resurrection. She ladled soup into bowls, thick with preserved carrots, beans, tomatoes, and they ate in silence while tears streamed down their faces without sound. Sarah spoke first, her voice breaking. The town, everyone's starving. 89 dead. Nothing left. Martha nodded, already moving, her response immediate and practical. How many survived? 340, maybe more. Martha walked to the cellar door, opened it, and gestured them down the stone steps into cool darkness. Sarah gasped. Lamplight reflected off rows of glass jars stretching 30 feet back into the hillside, 800 jars labeled and dated, their contents a spectrum of preserved life. Tomatoes, beans, beets, carrots, corn, preserved meat, pickles, fruit preserves. An archive of preparation that looked, in that moment, like the wealth of kingdoms. Voss stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, staring, then his knees buckled and he sat heavily on the stone steps. He put his face in his hands. "I called you mad." His voice was barely a whisper. Martha's response held no triumph, no vindication, only the plain truth of someone who had never needed validation. "You built for prosperity. I prepared for survival. We each did what made sense to us." She began loading jars into wooden crates, her movements efficient. "Help me carry these." They worked until sunset, loading Martha's wagon with 200 jars for the first delivery. The journey back took 4 hours through darkness, Martha driving, Sarah and Voss walking alongside like penitents. They arrived at the church at 11:47 at night. Survivors heard the wagon wheels on broken cobblestones and emerged from the building like ghosts. Children saw the jars by lamplight and began crying, not from hunger this time, but from relief so profound it had no other language. Martha opened the first jar, and the smell of preserved tomatoes filled the church like incense. Someone whispered, "She saved us," and the phrase spread through the crowd with the weight of liturgy. March 24th, Sarah returned to the valley with news that traveled faster than she could walk. "She has 800 jars. Enough to feed us for months. Her farm is undamaged." The exodus began within the hour. 340 survivors walked to Martha's farm in waves over 3 days, families carrying children, elderly supported by the young, the able-bodied hauling what little they'd salvaged. They arrived exhausted and Martha met them with systems already in place. She converted her barn into a communal kitchen, set up tents in the pasture, distributed blankets, organized cooking rotations with the efficiency of a quartermaster managing an army. Her farm became a refugee camp, then a community, then something closer to a revival. The 800 jars fed everyone, rationed carefully and supplemented with fresh eggs from Martha's chickens and milk from the 2 cows that had survived on higher ground. Each person received 1 jar serving daily plus bread baked in continuous rotations. Children stopped crying. Color returned to faces. On March 30th, the phrase transformed. A young boy asked his mother, "Is this the jar madness place?" She corrected him gently but firmly. "This is Martha's miracle. Remember that." The new phrase spread like a counter-rhythm to the old mockery, replacing it syllable by syllable until the previous cruelty became a memory that embarrassed those who'd participated. April 5th, the disaster officially ended. Flood waters fully receded, leaving the valley scarred but passable. The survivors remained at Martha's farm, not from necessity now, but from the recognition that they were learning something more valuable than temporary shelter. April 10th, a town meeting was held in Martha's barn. Carlton Voss stood before the assembled survivors and faced Martha with the entire community as witness. His voice was steady but stripped of everything except truth. "I owe this woman an apology. I owe all of you an apology." He paused, his throat working. "I spent $12,000 building a monument to my pride. It became a tomb for 23 people." He removed his gold watch, the one that had stopped at 6:23, and held it out to Martha. "This is worthless. What you have is priceless." Martha refused the watch with a slight shake of her head. "Keep it. Fix the time. Start again." Voss's eyes filled but he didn't look away. "I want to learn what you know. Will you teach me?" Martha's answer was immediate. "I'll teach anyone who wants to learn." Within days, she was conducting daily classes in preservation techniques, showing survivors the methods her grandmother had taught her: water bath canning, proper sealing temperatures, cellar construction, shelf life calculation. She distributed knowledge with the same generosity she distributed food, asking nothing in return. The community began rebuilding, but differently. Every new home included a root cellar, minimum 8 feet by 10 feet, stone-lined, properly ventilated. Every family learned preservation as a fundamental skill, not an eccentricity. The cooperative grain elevator was never rebuilt. Instead, the town adopted distributed storage, each family responsible for their own reserves, collective security through individual preparation. By autumn of 1891, 127 families had completed their own cellars. Total jars preserved collectively, 11,000 and counting. The town survived winter without external aid, without starvation, without the dependence that had defined their previous existence. If you found something valuable in this story, a reminder that preparation isn't paranoia, that wisdom sometimes wears the mask of foolishness until catastrophe reveals the truth, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it. These stories survive because people pass them forward. Thank you for listening this far. Spring 1892 brought delegations from surrounding towns who had heard the story of Milford Valley's survival. They came to learn Martha's system, and she taught freely, refusing any offer of payment. My grandmother gave this knowledge freely. So do I. By 1895, 14 regional towns had adopted the preservation culture, the practice spreading through Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin like a quiet revolution against the assumption that modernity eliminated the need for ancient skills. Carlton Voss became Martha's closest student, spending years redesigning storage systems across 3 states. He never charged for his work, telling anyone who asked, "I owe a debt I can never repay." The gold watch remained broken in his pocket until the day he died, a private penance he carried without explanation. By 1899, Martha was 70 and slowing. She'd trained over 200 people directly, influenced thousands indirectly, and transformed what had been mockery into a movement. She took a teaching role exclusively, no longer doing heavy preservation work herself but guiding young women who came weekly for instruction. Her farm became a pilgrimage site for those interested in preparedness, self-reliance, the quiet dignity of being ready for disaster without praying for it. In 1902, as her health declined, she prepared her own succession with the same care she'd applied to everything else. The farm was deeded to a community trust with a single instruction: keep the cellar full. Teach the children. Martha Henley died peacefully on November 15, 1903, at the age of 74. She passed in her sleep, in the house she defended through preparation rather than luck, surrounded by the jars she'd filled when filling jars was considered madness. Her funeral on November 18 drew 800 people from 7 states, one mourner for every jar that had saved them. The service was held in the rebuilt church, this time constructed on a stone foundation that would outlast the flood that had destroyed its predecessor. Carlton Voss, now 56 and white-haired, delivered the eulogy with a voice that carried the weight of earned humility. She was called mad for preparing. We were mad for mocking her. After the service, the town council announced their decision. Milford Valley would be officially renamed Henley, Indiana. Martha's farm would become the Henley Preservation Institute, dedicated to teaching the techniques she'd demonstrated and the philosophy she'd embodied. Her cellar was preserved exactly as she'd left it, a teaching museum where 800 empty jars were displayed on the original shelves, each one labeled with the name of a person it had fed during the 73 days when preparation became salvation. An annual tradition was established, Preservation Day, held every March 18, commemorating the flood and celebrating survival. Every family brought 1 jar of preserved food to a community feast, and children learned canning techniques in Martha's original kitchen. The tilted grain elevator was left standing deliberately, preserved as a memorial to the 23 dead and a warning against the kind of pride that builds monuments instead of margins. A plaque was installed at its base: "Pride builds high. Wisdom prepares deep." By 1950, Henley, Indiana had a population of 2,400. In the 47 years since Martha's death, there had been 0 deaths from food shortage. Every home maintained a functional root cellar. Preservation techniques were taught in schools as standard curriculum, passed down with the same seriousness as mathematics or literacy. In 2024, the Henley Preservation Institute continues operating, receiving over 15,000 visitors annually. Canning classes book months in advance. Martha's original cellar is maintained at precisely 56 degrees, the 800 jars still on display, each label still legible after more than a century. The institute expanded beyond food preservation to teach broader principles of self-reliance, preparedness, and the wisdom of building systems that survive crisis rather than assuming crisis will never come. On a winter evening, in the church basement where Martha once ladled soup from jars everyone said would spoil, a similar scene unfolds. The year is 2024, the disaster is economic collapse rather than flood, but the principle remains unchanged. Families gather around jars of preserved food, their survival secured by knowledge passed down through generations, by the muscle memory of preparation that became culture. A photograph of Martha Henley hangs on the wall, her face serious but not severe, her hands folded in her lap, the hands that prepared 800 jars while a town laughed. Beneath the photograph, a plaque bears the phrase that replaced mockery, Martha's miracle. In a classroom nearby, a modern teacher instructs a new generation in the same techniques Martha learned from her grandmother, taught to survivors, and transformed into legacy. The students are young, skeptical of skills that seem archaic in an era of refrigeration and global supply chains. The teacher understands their skepticism. She was skeptical once too, before the economic collapse, before the lesson became immediate. She shows them how to test jar seals, how to measure temperature, how to calculate shelf life and storage capacity. She tells them about the flood, about the elevator that became a tomb, about the widow who was right when everyone else was wrong. She explains that preparedness isn't pessimism, it's the humility to accept that systems fail, that certainty is temporary, that the difference between survival and catastrophe can be measured in jars sealed and lessons learned. The students listen with the particular attention of those who've recently discovered that old wisdom wasn't obsolete, just patient. Outside, snow falls on the town of Henley, Indiana. The tilted grain elevator stands at its permanent 30-degree angle, still visible after all these years, still teaching. Carlton Voss's monument collapsed in 1903, was cleared in 1911, and forgotten by 1930. But Martha's 800 jars fed 340 people for 73 days, inspired a preservation culture that spread across a continent, and saved tens of thousands over the course of more than a century. One structure reached for heaven and fell to earth. The other dug deep and lasted. In the Institute's preserved cellar, the 800 empty jars catch lamplight like they did in 1891, each one a testament to the radical act of preparing for disaster while hoping it never comes. The final class of the day ends. Students file out into winter evening, carrying new knowledge in old forms. The teacher remains, checking the cellar temperature one last time before locking up. 56 degrees. Perfect. She thinks about Martha sometimes, working alone while the town laughed, sealing jars with hands that never doubted even when her heart must have. The teacher extinguishes the lamp and climbs the stone steps. Behind her, in darkness, the jars wait, empty now but still teaching, still proving that wisdom doesn't need vindication to be right, only time. She prepared for the disaster she hoped would never come. When it came, she was ready. That's not madness. That's wisdom.